Hi there, a very good evening to you. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive to us tonight. In the next half hour, we're going to see what's making the headlines with the political editor at HuffPost UK, Kevin Schofield, and the economics editor at The Spectator, Kate Andrews. Both of you, welcome to the programme. Thank you very much for being with us this Sunday evening. First, though, let's have a look at what's on some of those front pages for tomorrow's reading. Starting with the Metro, it leads on the 3 Britons who are missing after a boat caught fire during a Red Sea diving trip. It's the arrest of Nicola Sturgeon on the front of the Express. It reports that the former First Minister has insisted that she is innocent of any wrongdoing. Same story dominating the front page of the Sun tomorrow, which says Ms Sturgeon was questioned by police for 7 hours. Now, The Guardian tomorrow says there is growing frustration amongst Conservative MPs over the behaviour of Boris Johnson and his allies. On to the Mail for you, Suella Braverman claiming that the Labour leader is in the pocket of road-blocking eco-protesters. And The Star reports on a new theory that the body of Henry I may be buried beneath Reading Prison's car park. Have to read a bit more about that in just a few minutes' time. A reminder for you that by scanning the QR code that you see on screen right now during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch with us. And of course, we're joined tonight, as I just said, by the political editor at the HuffPost UK, Kevin Schofield, and the economics editor at The Spectator, Kate Andrews. Well, let's go and chat to them both now. As I say, welcome again. Thank you for staying up, I'm sure way past your bedtime on a Sunday night to be with us. We are very grateful. Let's start with the Express front page, going large, as you can imagine, on, as what we learned today, the arrest of Nicola Sturgeon and being questioned under caution. Of course, she's been released without charge and she has vehemently expressed her innocence. Let's start with you, Kate. What do you make of this story?
It's an utterly remarkable story. As you say, Nicola Sturgeon has been released without charge, but it is really quite something that the former First Minister was arrested, and multiple papers are reporting that she was questioned for 7 hours. The police have said that she is a suspect in Operation Branchform, again, to repeat, released without charge, but they are looking into the financial irregularities around the SNP's finances. Operation Branchform goes back years now, as they have been looking into what is estimated to be about £600,000 that is alleged to have been spent potentially on campaign finance instead of a second referendum. As you say, Nicola Sturgeon has released a statement, and the statement is quite interesting because not only does she insist, in her words, beyond doubt, that she is innocent of any wrongdoing, she also reminds people that she's entitled to that presumption of innocence. She says innocence is not just a presumption that I am entitled to by law. And, this is a story now that is going to probably go on for quite more time. We are looking at the prospects of a general election next year. This is obviously very bad news for the SNP. It's also possible that we may not have answers by the time a general election comes around. And we're in really tricky territory now, where there's only so much that we're going to be able to say in this matter. But, very, very difficult day for the SNP. Humza Yousaf has been desperate to separate his party from the scandal going around the finances. But when you have the former First Minister arrested and questioned for 7 answers, it's near impossible to separate Nicola Sturgeon from a party that, frankly, she was very, very successful when she was there. Put aside the policies of the SNP and the impact of those, she's thought to be one of the most successful politicians in recent decades in the UK. So, it's just a remarkable, very fast story, actually, for Nicola Sturgeon, given the fact that she only resigned a few months ago. And we're here now.
Yeah, and in the space of a few hours, a huge amount of reaction as well to digest. I mean, Kevin, let's bring you in now. You're a political editor, so this is a story I'm sure you've been covering closely all day. I mean, what do you make of it? And also the political ramifications that potentially are apparent now.
Yeah, I mean, it came as a real surprise, obviously, if you remember, Nicola Sturgeon's husband, Peter Murrell, who had been the SNP's chief executive at the time of his arrest, is no longer. He was arrested a couple of months ago. That was followed quite soon after by the SNP's treasurer, now former treasurer, Colin Beattie. So in a sense, it was inevitable. We were expecting Nicola Sturgeon to be arrested at some point. However, it happening on a Sunday in itself was quite unusual and just the simple fact of Nicola Sturgeon being arrested is inevitably going to be a huge story. Now, the political implications are potentially huge. Obviously, as Kate says, we have to be a little bit careful what we say about the investigation itself, but it's undeniable that it's bad publicity for the SNP. And the last thing really that Humza Yousaf, who's trying to strike out on his own, set a fresh course for the SNP after a lengthy period in which Nicola Sturgeon and before her Alex Salmond led the party for the best part of 20 years, really. And these types of headlines just bring the whole story back into the forefront of the minds of voters in Scotland. Now, what's interesting is that support for independence hasn't really been affected by all the SNP scandals. It's still up around the high 40s, 50%, something like that. But support for the SNP has dipped, although they are still the most popular party in Scotland. And as Kate says, with the general election coming up next year, they've really got to try and get some more clear blue water between themselves and the Labour Party, or else they've got a lot of seats potentially at risk in that general election.
I know we're going to talk about Nicola Sturgeon a lot more in our 11 o'clock hour here on Sky News. So let's just park that here now to have a look at some more papers while we can. As well, slightly tight on time. Onto the front page of The Guardian. And we thought that politics was busy north of the border. It hasn't stopped in Westminster either, I have to say. And the Guardian tomorrow choosing, they have 3 stories on their front page, including Nicola Sturgeon's arrest. But what they choose to go large on is the line that senior Tories are telling Johnson to shut up and go away. Apparently, senior Conservatives have told Boris Johnson and his allies to shut up and go away as the Privileges Committee prepares to sign off on what's expected to be a damning report into his conduct. And this story just keeps rumbling on, doesn't it, Kate? What's your angle on it?
If you're a news junkie, it's been a big weekend for you, because before we had the arrest of Nicola Sturgeon, we had the resignation of Boris Johnson, which has come after he was given the heads up that the Privileges Committee was likely to rule against him. They are meeting at 11 a.m. tomorrow to finalize their conclusion, looking into their year-long inquiry on Partygate, whether or not the Prime Minister misled Parliament. And they are likely to speed up the publication of that report now that Boris Johnson has indeed resigned. Because he's resigned, there's some things we're not going to get. We're not going to get potential recall. We're not going to get Boris Johnson in a by-election. But there is some debate now about whether or not he could see the pass that would usually be permitted to him to access Parliament taken away. That's something that ultimately would fall to the Commons Speaker to decide, but there's pressure on Tory MPs to basically come out and have their say. And this quote on the front page of The Guardian is from Tim Lawton, who was a minister under David Cameron. And apparently he said, shut up and go away to Boris Johnson. Of course, we know that there are a lot of loyalists to Boris Johnson who are talking about giving up their own seats in protest for where the Tory party they feel has put Boris Johnson. They put more weight on the current Prime Minister rather than the former Prime Minister's actions during COVID. Yet another reminder that it's not just the SNP that's at war with itself, is also the Tory party. And as you say, a story that is very likely to continue on. I think Boris Johnson would have been leading every paper and all the headlines for the rest of the week if it hadn't been for Nicola Sturgeon's arrest.
Indeed. Just briefly, Kevin, will he shut up and go away? What do you think?
I think there's very little chance of that. I think now that he's now outside the tent, he will continue hurling rocks at Rishi Sunak for as long as he possibly can. He still blames Rishi Sunak largely for bringing him down, and is now free of any restrictions of being a Conservative MP. He can say what he likes and he can do what he likes. So that's a pretty good position for Boris Johnson to be in. Very uncomfortable for Rishi Sunak, a bit like Humza Yousaf, who doesn't want the SNP's woes to be in the headlines again. The last thing Rishi Sunak wants is Boris Johnson and Partygate to be all over the papers again, because that just reminds voters of why they were so angry with Boris Johnson before he resigned as Prime Minister. So yeah, not a great set of headlines for Rishi Sunak either, and it'll be fascinating to see how many more Conservative MPs break ranks and decide to keep this story bubbling over the next few days.
Indeed, and of course we're talking about 2 big political heavyweights, aren't we? Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson in just a space of 1 weekend. You guys have been very busy, haven't you? Let's have a look at the front page of the Daily Mail before we move to a quick break. Another big political story regarding Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary. She's writing actually in the Daily Mail tomorrow, saying that she's blasting Sir Keir Starmer as being in the pocket of the eco-mob as his party tries to crack down or block a crackdown on disruptive protests. Kevin, I'm going to start with you first on this one. What do you make of it?
Well, yeah, you can always rely on the Mail to try and give the Conservatives a positive headline where it's all negative pretty much everywhere else. And yes, Suella Braverman has chosen to write an article in the Daily Mail tomorrow. And it's quite interesting here. It's obviously a tactic that Conservatives are keen to use on Labour at the moment, is to try and link Labour with Just Stop Oil and the disruption that their protest caused for ordinary voters in the public's mind. Obviously, there are donations from Just Stop Oil's Dale Vince have gone to the Labour Party. Now, Labour have said that that does not in any way buy influence or dictate Labour policy. The Conservatives want to convince voters that that is not the case. Now, Labour are, Keir Starmer is preparing to make a big speech on energy the week after next. So all eyes will be on that. And I'm sure the Conservatives will be all over it to try and establish, as I say, some link between Just Stop Oil and the Labour Party. So yeah, clearly Suella Braverman in this article in the Daily Mail is wanting to establish that link and really hammer it home in the voters' mind. There's not much evidence looking at the polls that is cutting through just yet, but who knows? It might well be something that voters might want to think about.
Okay, Kate, let's bring you in. What do you make of this so-called attack line then from the Home Secretary? Will it work?
Well, it's not necessarily helpful to the Labour Party that it was revealed that one of the big backers of Just Stop Oil also gave over £1 million to the Labour Party. So, there are connections there in which I think the Home Secretary can draw, even if it's a very thin line between the Labour Party and perhaps some sympathy within the Labour Party to the radical protests of Just Stop Oil. But that's very different than tying it directly to Keir Starmer. And I think that's probably where the struggle is going to be. And, to totally separate Labour and Tory on law and order these days is becoming more and more difficult, just as it is on the economy, just as it is on a range of issues. But this is clearly an area where the Home Secretary still thinks she can draw a distinction. And she's highlighting how much time these protests have taken up from police officers. She estimates that it's taken up over 12,000 police officer shifts to deal with them when they could be tackling far more serious crimes. So clearly an area where the Tories still think that they can have a bit of sway, but tying it directly to the opposition leader is going to be a little more difficult.
At a cost of £14 million last year, she says. OK, Kate, for now, thank you very much. Kevin, thanks to you too. Plenty more from both of our guests in just a few minutes' time. Indeed, more stories from tomorrow's front pages, including this story that's on the front page of The Guardian. The headline, Ofsted overhaul fails to change schools' grading. We'll be reading that and getting some expert views for you in just a few minutes' time. Do stay with us. Hello there, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me tonight as the political editor at the HuffPost UK, Kevin Schofield. We're also joined by the economics editor at the Spectator, Kate Andrews. Welcome to you both. Thanks very much for being on board. And we're going to go straight back to The Guardian, the front page of that. Another story that they are highlighting here is Ofsted overhaul fails to change school gradings. Changes by Ofsted, they say, to the way it inspects schools have been criticised as being nowhere near enough to reduce high levels of stress involved which were blamed for the recent death of a popular head teacher. Kate, let's go to you for this one. Well, what is your reading of this story about Richard Adams?
So changes are being announced today in terms of the way that these schools will be graded, no pun intended, in order to ease some of that burden that's being felt by teachers when their schools are demoted. And this follows on from that very tragic suicide when a teacher was very stressed by that demotion. However, where Ofsted isn't budging is on these words like inadequate. They still want to be able to put one word on a school to give parents a very good indication of exactly what kind of education their kids are receiving. And this is in big dispute. And the criticism today is that that one word is not actually good enough to describe what's going on in the school. And obviously these changes are being made in a really delicate circumstance. So the difficulty around how one labels so that parents know exactly what's going on compared to the pressure that might even be put on individual teachers in many cases who will not be responsible for what's happening overall in the school is clearly a very, very difficult one to strike.
It is indeed. It actually features as well that story on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. So let's go to that paper now. Actually looking at a different story, their coverage of the goings-on in Westminster over the weekend, taking a slightly different angle, you could say. Sunak urged to cut tax amid fears of by-election losses. Kevin, what do you make of this?
Yes, so I mean, Rishi Sunak really doesn't have his problems to seek at the moment, all courtesy of one Boris Johnson. Nadine Dorris, which now seems like a lifetime ago, it was only Friday afternoon that she resigned with immediate effect as an MP. That was obviously followed by Boris Johnson. And then Nigel Adams, another Boris Johnson ally, he resigned on Saturday. So these three by-elections, all varying degrees of difficulty for the Conservatives, all obviously held by the Tories at the moment. Labour very confident in Uxbridge, Boris Johnson's old seat. The Lib Dems have got their eye on Mid-Bedfordshire, which is Nadine Dorris's seat, and Nigel Adams' seat as well as in, I think, Labour sites there as well. So really, these could be a real triple blow potentially for Rishi Sunak were he to lose them. Now, the Telegraph have been banging this drum for a while now about cutting taxes. We know that a lot of Conservative MPs, Conservative backbenchers, particularly on the right of the party, are very keen that Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, cuts taxes as soon as possible to give them any chance of winning the next election, they believe. So clearly they're now using these looming by-elections as further leverage, really, in trying to pile pressure on both Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt to start cutting taxes, because, as I say, they think that will be a vote winner, which is obviously what Rishi Sunak really needs right now.
Kate, let's bring you in. Economics editor, you're very well placed to talk about tax cuts. I mean, can they do it? Is it a possibility? What do you think?
It's difficult right now. It's certainly a possibility, and the tax burden's at a post-war high. In my opinion, it's far too high. But this does come with trade-offs, and it's what nobody's wanted to talk about for a long time now, and that's the other side of the ledger, which is spending. And COVID saw us spend hundreds of billions of more pounds. Interest costs are up, borrowing costs are through the roof. Just to service the debt, to service money that we've already spent, we are paying near record levels to do so at the moment. So if you want to cut tax, I think as Liz Truss taught the Labour Party and the Conservative Party last autumn, you have to make some trade-offs. The tax cuts aren't fundamentally the problem. It's promising deficit finance tax cuts when you're also spending, tens of billions of more pounds. And this Tory government under Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt has opted to spend more money on things like their new childcare policy. So, and more money for the...
Kate, I'm going to jump in there because we are running out of time, but you'll be able to finish your points in the 11 o'clock hour, I promise you. Kate and Andrew, Kate and Kevin, thank you so much for that.